In the shadow of Regency England's grandest estates, where honour and vengeance intertwined like thorns around a rose, Lady Evelyn Hartwell believed she was entering a fairy tale. The Duke of Ravenshollow had chosen her, a baron's daughter with little fortune but boundless hope. Yet as the cathedral bells ceased their joyous chiming and her new husband's mask finally slipped, his cold whisper shattered her dreams. "I only married you to watch you suffer." What dark secret had turned love into a weapon of revenge? If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Hartwell Manor like a silk veil, obscuring the modest estate that had been Lady Evelyn Hartwell's entire world for 22 years. From her bedroom window, she watched the groundskeepers tend to the rose garden her late mother had planted, their movements deliberate and reverent in the early dawn light. The roses bloomed, despite the family's dwindling fortune, as if beauty could flourish where prosperity had withered. "Evelyn, darling, you must come down immediately," called her father, Baron Hartwell, his voice carrying an unusual note of excitement that echoed through the oak-panelled corridors. "We have received the most extraordinary correspondence." She descended the grand staircase, her fingers trailing along the worn banister that had been polished smooth by generations of Hartwells. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast dancing shadows across the faded tapestries, remnants of better times when the family name carried weight beyond mere nobility. In the drawing room, her father stood beside the marble fireplace, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held an envelope bearing an impressive crimson seal. The Duke of Ravenshollow's coat of arms, a raven perched atop a crown of thorns, gleamed in the morning light. "His Grace requests the honour of calling upon you this afternoon," Baron Hartwell announced, his voice barely containing his amazement. "The Duke of Ravenshollow himself, Evelyn. One of the most powerful men in all of England." Evelyn's heart fluttered like a caged bird. She had heard whispers of the Duke at various social gatherings, a man of 30 years whose dark handsomeness was matched only by his vast wealth and mysterious nature. Some said he had never shown interest in any lady of the ton, preferring the solitude of his northern estates to the glittering ballrooms of London. "But, Father, why would His Grace wish to call upon me?" she asked, smoothing her simple morning dress of pale blue muslin. "Surely there are ladies of greater fortune and standing who would better suit his attention." Baron Hartwell's eyes softened with paternal affection. "My dear child, you possess something far more valuable than gold, a pure heart and gentle spirit. Perhaps the Duke has finally recognized that true worth cannot be measured in pounds sterling." Bride. As the afternoon approached, Evelyn found herself in a state of nervous anticipation. Her lady's maid, the faithful Mrs. Pemberton, fussed over her appearance, arranging her chestnut curls and selecting her finest afternoon dress, a creation of ivory silk with delicate pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. "You look radiant, my lady," Mrs. Pemberton declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Like a princess from one of those fairy tales your dear mother used to read to you." The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the Duke's arrival. Through the drawing-room window, Evelyn caught her first glimpse of Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshollow. He dismounted from a magnificent black stallion with fluid grace, his tall frame imposing even at a distance. His dark hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and his aristocratic features seemed carved from marble, beautiful, yet somehow forbidding. When he entered the drawing-room, the very air seemed to change. His presence commanded attention, and his steel-grey eyes swept the modest surroundings with an unreadable expression. He was dressed impeccably in a midnight blue coat and pristine white cravat, every inch the powerful nobleman. "Your Grace," Baron Hartwell bowed deeply, "may I present my daughter, Lady Evelyn?" Evelyn curtsied gracefully, her eyes meeting the Duke's for a brief, electrifying moment. "Your Grace, it is an honor." "The honor is entirely mine, Lady Evelyn," the Duke replied, his voice a rich baritone that seemed to resonate through her very soul. He took her gloved hand and pressed it to his lips, in a gesture both proper and somehow intimate. Your beauty surpasses even the most glowing reports I have heard. The courtship that followed was like something from a dream. The Duke called upon her regularly, bringing gifts of rare books and exotic flowers. He spoke eloquently of poetry and philosophy, his intelligence matching her own in ways that thrilled her romantic heart. During their walks through the manor's gardens, he listened intently to her thoughts on literature and art, treating her opinions with a respect she had rarely experienced from gentlemen of her acquaintance. "You have a remarkable mind, Lady Evelyn," he said one afternoon as they paused beside her mother's rose garden. "It would be a tragedy for such intelligence to remain hidden away in the countryside." Their conversations flowed like music, and Evelyn found herself falling deeply in love with this enigmatic man who seemed to see her true worth. When he spoke of his estates in the north, his voice carried a note of loneliness that touched her compassionate heart. "Ravenshollow Castle has been in my family for centuries," he told her, his grey eyes distant. "But it has been far too long since laughter echoed through its halls. A place of such grandeur requires a mistress who can bring light to its shadows." 3 weeks after their first meeting, as autumn painted the countryside in shades of gold and crimson, the Duke made his proposal. They stood in the conservatory, surrounded by the last blooms of the season, when he suddenly dropped to one knee. "Lady Evelyn Hartwell," he said, producing a ring of stunning sapphires and diamonds, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I offer you not just my name and fortune, but my heart and devotion for all eternity." Through tears of joy, Evelyn whispered her acceptance, believing with all her innocent heart that she had found her fairy tale ending. The Duke slipped the ring onto her finger, and as he rose to kiss her hand, she thought she glimpsed something cold and calculating in his eyes. But the moment passed so quickly that she convinced herself it had been merely a trick of the fading light. The engagement was announced in the Times, causing a sensation throughout London society. Invitations to the wedding poured in from the highest echelons of the ton, and Baron Hartwell walked with renewed pride, his daughter's brilliant match restoring lustre to the family name. Yet, as the wedding day approached, Evelyn began to notice subtle changes in her betrothed. His smiles seemed less warm, his compliments more practiced. When she mentioned these concerns to Mrs. Pemberton, the older woman dismissed them as pre-wedding nerves. "All brides feel uncertain before their wedding day, my lady," she assured her. "His Grace is a complex man, but his devotion to you is evident to all who see you together." But what dark secret lay hidden behind the Duke's perfect facade? And why did Evelyn sometimes catch him watching her with an expression that seemed more like satisfaction than love? The morning of her wedding dawned with deceptive beauty, as if nature herself conspired to mock what was to come. Westminster Abbey stood resplendent in the golden October sunlight, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of royal ceremonies and noble unions. The cream of London society had gathered within its hallowed walls, their silk gowns and jewelled tiaras creating a kaleidoscope of wealth and privilege that would have taken Evelyn's breath away under different circumstances. As her carriage approached the cathedral, Evelyn's hands trembled within her ivory gloves. Her wedding dress, a masterpiece of French silk and Belgian lace that had cost her father nearly his last penny, rustled softly with each breath. The Hartwell family diamonds, her grandmother's final gift, sparkled at her throat, catching the light that streamed through the carriage windows. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," Baron Hartwell said, his voice thick with emotion as he squeezed her hand. "Your mother would have been so proud to see this day." The cathedral's interior was a vision of opulence that spoke to the Duke's immense wealth and social standing. White roses and orange blossoms adorned every pillar, their fragrance mingling with the incense that hung heavy in the air. The guest list read like a directory of England's most powerful families, dukes and duchesses, Earls and countesses, all eager to witness what society had dubbed the wedding of the season. Indeed, as Evelyn walked down the endless aisle on her father's arm, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Whispered conversations ceased as she passed, replaced by the soft rustle of silk and the occasional gasp of admiration. At the altar, the Duke of Ravenshollow waited in his formal court dress, his dark hair perfectly arranged and his aristocratic features composed in an expression of solemn dignity. Yet something in his steel-grey eyes made Evelyn's steps falter for just a moment. Where she expected to see love and anticipation, she glimpsed something else entirely, a cold satisfaction that sent an inexplicable chill down her spine. But the moment passed quickly, and she attributed her unease to wedding day nerves. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself presided over the ceremony, his ancient voice carrying the sacred words that would bind them together for eternity. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As the ceremony progressed, Evelyn found herself stealing glances at her soon-to-be husband. His responses were perfectly timed, his voice steady and sure, yet there was something mechanical about his demeanor that troubled her romantic heart. When the moment came for him to place the wedding ring upon her finger, his touch was cold, despite the warmth of the day. "With this ring, I thee wed," he intoned, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. "With my body, I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods, I thee endow." The words that should have filled her with joy instead felt hollow, as if spoken by an actor playing a role, rather than a man declaring his love. But before she could dwell on these troubling thoughts, the Archbishop was pronouncing them husband and wife. "You may kiss the bride," the elderly cleric announced with a benevolent smile. The Duke's lips touched hers in a kiss that was perfectly proper, yet utterly devoid of warmth or passion. As they turned to face the congregation as man and wife, the cathedral erupted in applause, and the triumphant notes of the organ filled the air. Evelyn smiled and nodded graciously at the well-wishers, playing her part in what felt increasingly like an elaborate theatrical performance. The wedding breakfast was held at Ravenshollow House, the Duke's magnificent London residence. The ballroom had been transformed into a garden paradise, with thousands of white roses creating an ethereal backdrop for the celebration. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across the assembled guests, who dined on delicacies prepared by the finest chefs in London. Evelyn sat at the head table beside her new husband, accepting congratulations and well wishes from an endless stream of nobility. The Duke played his part perfectly, his hand occasionally covering hers in gestures of husbandly affection that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "Your Grace," gushed the Countess of Pembroke, "what a divine couple you make. Lady Evelyn, you must be the happiest woman in all of England." "Indeed," Evelyn replied with a smile that felt increasingly strained. "I am most blessed." As the afternoon wore on, she noticed her husband's attention seemed focused not on her, but on scanning the crowd with an intensity that puzzled her. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his fingers drummed silently against the table in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained tension. It was during the traditional toasts that everything began to unravel. The Duke rose to address his guests, his commanding presence immediately silencing the room. He lifted his crystal champagne flute, and every eye turned toward him in expectation of the customary words of love and gratitude. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom, "I thank you for joining us on this most significant day." There was something in his tone that made Evelyn's blood run cold, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. "Marriage," the Duke continued, his grey eyes sweeping the crowd with predatory satisfaction, "is indeed a sacred institution. It binds families together, settles old debts, and sometimes—" He paused, his gaze finally settling on Evelyn with an expression that made her heart stop. provides the perfect opportunity for justice to be served. A murmur of confusion rippled through the assembled guests. This was not the speech of a devoted bridegroom, and the atmosphere in the room began to shift from celebration to unease. "You see," the Duke's voice grew harder, more deliberate. 23 years ago, Baron Hartwell made certain choices that destroyed my family. Choices that led directly to my father's death and my mother's madness. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face as her father half rose from his seat, his face pale with shock and dawning horror. "Adrian, what are you—" "Sit down," the Duke commanded with such authority that Baron Hartwell sank back into his chair as if struck. "You will listen to what you have wrought." The ballroom had fallen into complete silence, the only sound the soft clink of crystal as trembling hands set down champagne flutes. Evelyn's mind reeled as she tried to process what was happening, her fairy tale wedding transforming into a nightmare before her very eyes. My father, the previous Duke of Ravenshollow, trusted Baron Hartwell with a business venture that would have secured both our families' futures, the Duke continued, his voice carrying the weight of long-nursed grievance. Instead, Hartwell absconded with the entire investment, £50,000, leaving my father ruined and disgraced. "That's not true," Baron Hartwell protested, his voice breaking. "The venture failed. I lost everything as well." "Lies," the Duke spat, his composure finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "You took the money and fled to your country estate, leaving my father to face his creditors alone. He put a pistol to his head rather than endure the shame, and my mother never recovered from the shock. She died in Bedlam, raving about betrayal and lost honor." Evelyn's world tilted on its axis as the horrible truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. This had never been about love or even attraction. She had been nothing more than a pawn in an elaborate game of revenge, her heart and future sacrificed on the altar of her father's alleged sins. "So you see, my dear wife," the Duke turned to her with a smile that was all sharp edges and cold triumph, "I have not married you for love or even for convenience. I have married you for the exquisite pleasure of watching Baron Hartwell's beloved daughter suffer as my family suffered. Every day of your life will be a reminder to him of the price of betrayal." The gasps and exclamations from the guests created a cacophony of shock and scandal. Several ladies reached for their smelling salts, while gentlemen muttered among themselves in outrage and disbelief. The wedding breakfast had become a public execution, with Evelyn as the unwilling victim. "I only married you to watch you suffer," the Duke concluded, his words falling like stones into the silence that followed. "And suffer you shall, in ways you cannot yet imagine." Evelyn sat frozen in her chair, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. The man she had believed loved her, the fairy tale prince who had swept her off her feet, had revealed himself to be her worst nightmare. Every kind word, every gentle touch, every moment of what she had believed to be courtship had been nothing but an elaborate lie designed to lure her into this trap. The room erupted into chaos as guests began to murmur and whisper, some rising from their seats in shock and indignation. But Evelyn heard none of it. She could only stare at her husband's face, searching for any trace of the man she thought she had married, and finding only cold satisfaction and barely contained malice. What cruel fate awaited her in the halls of Ravenshollow Castle, and could any force on earth save her from the vengeance of a man who had made hatred his bride? The journey to Ravenshollow Castle stretched across 3 days of torment, each mile taking Evelyn further from everything she had ever known and deeper into what felt like a waking nightmare. The Duke's travelling coach, though luxuriously appointed with velvet cushions and gold fittings, felt more like a prison cell as it rolled through the increasingly desolate Yorkshire countryside. Her new husband rode alongside the carriage on his black stallion, maintaining a distance that spoke volumes about his intentions. When they stopped at coaching inns for the night, he was coldly polite in public, playing the role of devoted bridegroom for the benefit of curious onlookers. But the moment they were alone, His mask slipped to reveal the calculating stranger who had destroyed her world. "I trust you are comfortable, Your Grace," he would say with mock solicitude, the title dripping from his lips like poison. "We must ensure you arrive at your new home in perfect health. After all, what pleasure would there be in watching you suffer if you were to fall ill along the way?" Evelyn had retreated into herself, speaking only when directly addressed and spending long hours staring out at the passing landscape. The rolling green hills of her childhood gave way to stark moors and craggy peaks that seemed to mirror the desolation in her heart. She clutched her mother's prayer book, the only comfort she had been allowed to bring, and tried to find solace in familiar verses, though the words seemed to blur through her tears. Ravenshollow Castle emerged from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, its dark towers and battlements silhouetted against the stormy sky. The ancient fortress had been built to withstand sieges, its massive walls and narrow windows speaking of centuries of conflict and bloodshed. As their carriage passed through the iron gates, Evelyn felt as though she were entering a tomb. The castle's interior was as forbidding as its exterior, despite the obvious wealth that had been lavished upon its restoration. Tapestries depicting scenes of battle and conquest adorned the walls, while suits of armor stood sentinel in shadowy alcoves. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of history and the echoes of long-dead voices. "Welcome to your new home, my dear wife," the Duke said, as they stood in the great hall, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I do hope you find it educational." The household staff assembled to greet their new mistress presented a study in barely concealed hostility. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackthorne, was a severe woman whose iron-grey hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. The butler, Grimsby, looked as though he had stepped from a funeral parlour, his pale complexion and hollow cheeks giving him an almost spectral appearance. "Mrs. Blackthorne will show you to your chambers," the Duke announced with cold formality. "I trust you will find them adequate for your needs." Evelyn's rooms were located in the castle's east wing, as far from the Duke's quarters as possible while still remaining within the main structure. The suite was undeniably beautiful, with silk wallpaper in shades of blue and gold, and furniture that spoke of exquisite craftsmanship and considerable expense. Yet the windows were barred, ostensibly for security, the Duke explained with a cruel smile, and the doors locked from the outside each night. "For your protection, of course," he had said on that first evening, his grey eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "These old castles can be dangerous for those unfamiliar with their secrets." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of isolation and despair. Evelyn was permitted to roam certain areas of the castle during daylight hours, always under the watchful eye of Mrs. Blackthorne or one of the other servants. Meals were served in her chambers, elaborate affairs that mocked her situation. What use was the finest cuisine when one's heart was breaking? The Duke appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes joining her for dinner in the formal dining room, where he would regale her with stories of her father's alleged crimes, each tale more damning than the last. He spoke of forged documents and secret meetings, of money hidden away while honest investors faced ruin. "Your father was quite clever," he would say, cutting his meat with surgical precision. "He managed to convince everyone that he was as much a victim as the rest of us. But I knew better. I always knew better." Evelyn tried to defend her father's honour, but her protests fell on deaf ears. The Duke had constructed an elaborate narrative of betrayal and revenge, and nothing she could say would shake his conviction. Worse still, she began to notice inconsistencies in his stories, details that changed from one telling to the next, but pointing this out only seemed to fuel his anger. It was during her third week at Ravenshollow that salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. Lady Agatha Pemberton, the Duke's elderly aunt, came to visit unannounced, sweeping into the castle like a force of nature despite her 70-odd years. "Adrian, you impossible boy," she declared upon her arrival, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "What is this nonsense I hear about your marriage? And where is this mysterious bride you've been hiding away? Lady Agatha was everything the castle was not, warm, vibrant, and utterly unintimidated by her nephew's dark moods. She had silver hair that caught the light like spun moonbeams, and eyes the same grey as the Duke's, but filled with intelligence and compassion rather than cold calculation. Her travelling dress was fashionable but practical, and she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had navigated London society for decades. "Aunt Agatha," the Duke said through gritted teeth, "your visit is unexpected." "Unexpected and necessary from what I can see," she replied tartly, her sharp gaze taking in the oppressive atmosphere of the great hall. "Now, where is Lady Evelyn? I have come specifically to meet her." When Lady Agatha was finally introduced to Evelyn, the older woman's expression shifted from curiosity to concern, and then to barely concealed outrage. She took one look at Evelyn's pale complexion and haunted eyes, and immediately demanded a private audience. "My dear child," Lady Agatha said once they were alone in Evelyn's chambers, "you look as though you've seen a ghost. What has that nephew of mine been doing to you?" For the first time since her wedding day, Evelyn found herself in the presence of someone who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. The kindness in Lady Agatha's voice broke through the walls she had built around her heart, and the whole terrible story came pouring out. The deception, the public humiliation, the imprisonment disguised as marriage. Lady Agatha listened in growing horror, her face darkening with each revelation. When Evelyn finished her tale, the older woman sat in stunned silence for several moments before speaking. "That foolish, foolish boy," she whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow and anger. "He has let his father's bitterness poison his soul beyond all reason." "You knew his father?" Evelyn asked, grasping at any hope of understanding the forces that had destroyed her life. "I knew them all," Lady Agatha replied sadly. "Adrian's father, your father, the whole tragic business, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that your father was no villain. The investment venture failed due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. A ship lost at sea, a warehouse fire, a dozen small disasters that combined into one great catastrophe." Evelyn's heart leaped with hope. "Then my father is innocent as any man can be in matters of business and chance," Lady Agatha confirmed. "But Adrian's father could not accept that sometimes fortune simply turns against us. He needed someone to blame, and your father became his scapegoat. When the Duke took his own life, he left behind letters filled with accusations and demands for vengeance. Adrian found them after his mother's death and has been nursing this poisonous grudge ever since." The revelation that her suffering was based on lies and misunderstandings filled Evelyn with a complex mixture of relief and rage. Her father's honor was intact, but she remained trapped in a marriage built on false foundations. "What am I to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am bound to him by law and sacred vow. There is no escape from this nightmare." Lady Agatha's eyes flashed with determination. "There is always hope, my dear, always. But first you must remember who you are. Not the victim Adrian has tried to make you, but Lady Evelyn Hartwell, a woman of intelligence, courage and worth. You have been battered but not broken, and that is where your strength lies." Over the following days, Lady Agatha's presence transformed the atmosphere at Raven's Hollow Castle. She insisted on taking meals with both Evelyn and the Duke, her sharp wit and uncompromising manner forcing a semblance of civilized behavior. She regaled them with stories of London society, spoke of books and art and music, and gradually began to draw Evelyn out of her shell. "You have a remarkable mind, my dear," Lady Agatha observed one afternoon as they walked in the castle's walled garden. "It would be a tragedy to let it wither away in this gloomy place. Have you given any thought to what you might do if circumstances were different?" "I used to dream of writing," Evelyn admitted, the words feeling strange after weeks of silence. "Stories, perhaps, or essays on social reform, but such dreams seem foolish now." "Dreams are never foolish," Lady Agatha replied firmly. "They are the seeds from which great changes grow. And speaking of change, I've been thinking about your situation. There are people in London, progressive thinkers, reformers, writers, who would value your intelligence and perspective. The world is changing, my dear, and women like you are helping to shape that change." As Lady Agatha spoke of literary salons and intellectual circles, of women who were making their mark on society through their words and ideas, Evelyn felt something stirring within her that she had thought lost forever: hope. Perhaps there was life beyond the walls of Ravenshollow Castle, a future where she could be more than just a pawn in someone else's game of revenge. But even as hope began to bloom in her heart, she wondered if the Duke would ever allow her the freedom to pursue such dreams, and what price she might have to pay for daring to reach beyond the prison he had built around her. Lady Agatha's visit extended far beyond the customary week of polite society calls, much to the Duke's barely concealed irritation. For 6 weeks, she remained at Ravenshollow Castle, and during that time she orchestrated what could only be described as Evelyn's resurrection. Each morning brought lessons in deportment and conversation, not to make Evelyn more submissive, but to sharpen her natural intelligence into a weapon of wit and grace. "A woman's mind is her greatest asset," Lady Agatha declared during one of their sessions in the castle's library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that had gathered dust for years. "But it must be wielded with precision. Watch how I handle your husband's barbs, my dear. Never meet anger with anger. Meet it with intelligence, and watch how quickly a bully retreats." Under Lady Agatha's tutelage, Evelyn began to rediscover herself. The pale, frightened girl who had arrived at Ravenshollow was gradually replaced by a woman of quiet strength and growing confidence. She read voraciously: philosophy, literature, political treatises, her mind hungry for knowledge after weeks of enforced ignorance. The transformation did not go unnoticed by the Duke. During their increasingly tense dinner conversations, he found his usual tactics of intimidation and psychological warfare blunted by Evelyn's newfound composure. When he spoke of her father's alleged crimes, she would listen with polite attention before calmly presenting alternative interpretations of the events he described. "How fascinating that you should see it that way, Your Grace," she would say, her voice steady and clear. "Though I confess, your account differs significantly from the business records I have been studying. Perhaps there are documents you have not yet examined." Such responses clearly frustrated the Duke, who had grown accustomed to reducing her to tears with his accusations. Now she met his gaze steadily, her green eyes reflecting not fear, but a growing understanding of his own weaknesses and insecurities. It was Lady Agatha who suggested the London visit that would change everything. "The Duchess of Marlborough is hosting her annual winter salon," she announced one December morning as snow began to dust the castle's battlements. "The finest minds in England gather to discuss literature, politics, and social reform. It would be criminal to deny London society the pleasure of meeting the new Duchess of Ravenshollow." The Duke's objection was immediate and vehement. "Absolutely not. Evelyn has no business in London society." On the contrary," Lady Agatha replied with steel in her voice, "she has every business there. She is your wife, Adrian, whether you like it or not, and her absence from society reflects poorly on your family name. Unless, of course, you prefer that people whisper about the Duke who keeps his bride locked away like some Gothic villain." The argument that followed was epic in its scope, with Lady Agatha deploying decades of social warfare experience against her nephew's stubborn resistance. In the end, it was the threat to his precious reputation that swayed him. The Duke of Ravenshollow could not afford to appear weak or eccentric in the eyes of his peers. "Very well," he conceded through gritted teeth, "but she goes under strict supervision, and we return to Ravenshollow immediately after the salon." The journey to London felt like an escape from prison. Evelyn sat beside Lady Agatha in the travelling coach, watching the familiar countryside roll past, with eyes that saw everything anew. She was no longer the naive girl who had made this journey in reverse months earlier. The woman who would enter London society bore little resemblance to the broken creature who had left it. Lady Agatha had spared no expense in preparing Evelyn for her re-entry into the social world. A team of London's finest dressmakers had created a wardrobe that spoke of sophistication and quiet confidence. Gone were the pale virginal colours of her youth, replaced by rich emeralds and deep sapphires that complemented her colouring and reflected her newfound strength. "Remember," Lady Agatha counselled as their coach approached Marlborough House, "you are not the same woman who left London in disgrace. You are the Duchess of Ravenshollow, a woman of intelligence and substance. Let them see who you truly are." The Duchess of Marlborough's salon was legendary throughout London, drawing together the most brilliant minds of the age. Politicians debated with philosophers, poets conversed with scientists, and progressive thinkers of every stripe gathered to exchange ideas that would shape the future of England. When Evelyn entered the grand drawing room on the Duke's arm, a subtle hush fell over the assembled company. Many remembered the scandal of her wedding, the public humiliation that had shocked even jaded London society. They expected to see a broken woman, perhaps, or at best a pale shadow of her former self. Instead, they beheld a vision of quiet elegance and unmistakable intelligence. Evelyn's emerald silk gown was cut in the latest fashion, its rich colour bringing out the fire in her auburn hair and the depth of her green eyes. She moved with grace and confidence, her head held high as she acknowledged the curious stares with polite nods. "Your Grace," the Duchess of Marlborough greeted her warmly, "how delightful to see you in London again. We have heard such intriguing things about your time in Yorkshire." "Your Grace is too kind," Evelyn replied with a smile that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. "Ravenshollow Castle has provided ample opportunity for study and reflection. I find myself quite eager to engage with the intellectual discourse for which your salons are so justly famous." The Duke watched this exchange with growing unease. This was not the submissive, broken woman he had left behind at the castle. Something fundamental had changed, and he found himself uncertain how to respond to this new version of his wife. As the evening progressed, Evelyn found herself drawn into conversations that challenged and stimulated her mind in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. She discussed Mary Wollstonecraft's writings with a group of progressive ladies, debated the merits of social reform with several members of Parliament, and found herself holding her own in discussions that would have intimidated her months earlier. It was during one such conversation that she first encountered Dr. Elias Reed. Dr. Reed was not what one would expect to find at a duchess's salon. A physician by training and a social reformer by conviction, he had earned his invitation through his groundbreaking work with London's poor and his eloquent writings on public health. He was perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see everything. "Your Grace," he said, approaching her during a lull in the evening's discussions, "I could not help but overhear your comments on the need for improved sanitation in industrial cities. Your insights are remarkably astute for someone who has spent recent months in the countryside." "You flatter me, Dr. Reed," Evelyn replied, recognizing his name from articles she had read in progressive journals, "though I confess that distance sometimes provides clarity. When one observes society from the outside, its flaws become more apparent." Their conversation flowed with an ease that surprised them both. Dr. Reed spoke passionately of his work in London's East End, of the children dying from preventable diseases and the women struggling to survive in impossible conditions. Evelyn found herself sharing her own thoughts on social reform, ideas that had crystallized during her months of enforced isolation. "You speak with the voice of experience, Doctor," Reed observed, his brown eyes studying her face with professional interest. "There is a depth to your understanding that suggests personal knowledge of suffering." "Perhaps," Evelyn replied carefully, aware that the Duke was watching their interaction with growing displeasure. "I have learned that adversity can be an excellent teacher if one is willing to learn its lessons." Across the room, the Duke's jaw tightened as he observed his wife's animated conversation with the doctor. This was not part of his plan. Evelyn was supposed to remain isolated and dependent, not flourishing in intellectual discourse with other men. The sight of her laughing at something Dr. Reed had said filled him with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. "Adrian!" Lady Agatha appeared at his elbow, her voice deceptively casual. "Your wife is quite the sensation this evening. Several people have commented on her intelligence and grace. You must be very proud." "Proud?" The Duke's voice was barely controlled. "She is making a spectacle of herself, engaging in inappropriate conversation with that tradesman." "Dr. Reed is hardly a tradesman," Lady Agatha replied coolly. "He is one of London's most respected physicians and a published author. His conversation would be considered an honour by any intelligent woman." The Duke's response was cut short by the approach of Lord Pemberton, an influential member of Parliament and old family friend. "Ravenshollow," Lord Pemberton greeted him with hearty enthusiasm. "You sly devil! You've been hiding a treasure in that castle of yours. Your Duchess is absolutely brilliant. I've just spent 20 minutes discussing factory reform with her, and her insights are remarkable. Where on earth did you find such a gem?" Before the Duke could respond, they were joined by several other gentlemen, all eager to praise Evelyn's intelligence and charm. The Duke found himself in the uncomfortable position of accepting congratulations for his wife's success, while inwardly seething at her independence. As the evening drew to a close, Dr. Reed approached Evelyn once more, this time with a proposal that would change everything. "Your Grace," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I wonder if I might be so bold as to suggest a collaboration. I am organizing a series of lectures on social reform to be held at the Royal Institution. Your insights on the intersection of class and gender in social policy would be invaluable. Would you consider contributing an essay to our publication?" Evelyn's heart leaped at the opportunity, but she was acutely aware of her husband's presence nearby. "I am honored by your suggestion, Dr. Reed, but I fear my circumstances may not permit such involvement." "Of course," Dr. Reed replied, though his eyes conveyed understanding of the constraints she faced. "Perhaps, if circumstances change, you might reconsider. The world needs voices like yours, Your Grace. It would be a tragedy for such intelligence to remain hidden." As they prepared to leave Marlborough House, the Duke's anger was palpable. He maintained his composure until they reached their London residence, but once the doors closed behind them, his fury erupted. "What was the meaning of that display?" he demanded, his grey eyes blazing with rage. "You made yourself the centre of attention, flirting shamelessly with that doctor and discussing matters far beyond your understanding." For the first time since their wedding day, Evelyn met his anger with her own. "I engaged in intelligent conversation with educated people, Your Grace. If that threatens you, perhaps you should examine why." The Duke stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You forget yourself, madam. You are my wife, my property, and you will conduct yourself accordingly." "I am your wife," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the fear that coursed through her. "But I am not your property. I am a human being with a mind and a voice, and I will not be silenced by your petty jealousies and insecurities." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything that had passed between them before. For months, the Duke had held all the power, using fear and isolation to control her. But the woman who faced him now was not the broken girl he had brought to Ravenshollow. She had found her strength, and with it, the courage to fight back. What would be the consequences of this newfound defiance? And could Evelyn's growing confidence survive the Duke's inevitable retaliation? The confrontation in their London residence marked a turning point that neither Evelyn nor the Duke could have anticipated. In the days that followed, a cold war settled between them, each testing the boundaries of this new dynamic. The Duke, accustomed to absolute control, found himself facing a wife who no longer cowered at his threats, while Evelyn discovered that standing up to her tormentor brought both liberation and peril. Their return to Ravenshollow Castle was postponed indefinitely as London society clamoured for more of the brilliant Duchess who had so captivated the Marlborough salon. Invitations poured in from the city's most influential hostesses, each eager to secure the presence of this intriguing woman who combined beauty, intelligence, and an air of mysterious tragedy that made her irresistible to the social elite. Lady Agatha, recognizing the strategic importance of this moment, orchestrated Evelyn's social calendar with military precision. "Strike while the iron is hot, my dear," she counseled during one of their morning consultations. "Society's attention is fickle, but if you establish yourself now as a woman of substance, that reputation will serve you well in whatever future awaits." The Duke found himself trapped by his own pride and social position. To forbid his wife's participation in society would confirm the whispers that he was indeed the Gothic villain of their marriage. Yet allowing her continued freedom meant watching her slip further from his control with each passing day. It was during the third week of their extended London stay that Dr. Elias Reed made his move. He appeared at their Mayfair residence during calling hours, ostensibly to pay his respects to the Duke and Duchess. But his true purpose became clear when he presented Evelyn with a leather-bound portfolio. "Your Grace," he said, his brown eyes warm with admiration and something deeper, "I have taken the liberty of compiling some materials related to our discussion of social reform. I thought you might find them of interest." The Duke, who had been forced by propriety to receive the doctor in his own drawing room, watched this exchange with barely concealed hostility. "How thoughtful of you, Dr. Reed, though I fear my wife has little time for such academic pursuits." "On the contrary," Evelyn interjected smoothly, accepting the portfolio with a gracious smile, "I find myself with considerable time for intellectual endeavours. The mind, like the body, requires exercise to remain healthy." Dr. Reed's eyes met hers with understanding and approval. "Indeed, Your Grace, and if I may be so bold, I believe your mind is one of the finest I have encountered. It would be a disservice to society to allow such brilliance to remain hidden." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in social warfare, with Dr. Reed and Evelyn engaging in stimulating discourse while the Duke sat increasingly marginalized, his attempts to redirect the conversation repeatedly thwarted by his wife's newfound confidence and the doctor's diplomatic skill. "I have been reading about the working conditions in Manchester's textile mills," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the authority of genuine knowledge. "The mortality rates among child workers are appalling. Surely there must be legislative remedies available?" "You touch upon one of the great challenges of our time," Dr. Reed replied, leaning forward with evident enthusiasm. "The intersection of industrial progress and human welfare requires careful navigation. I have been working with several members of Parliament on proposed reforms, but progress is slow." "Perhaps," Evelyn suggested, her eyes bright with possibility, "what is needed is a voice that can speak to both the humanitarian and economic aspects of reform. Someone who understands the human cost, but can also articulate the long-term benefits to society as a whole." The Duke's cup rattled against its saucer as he set it down with barely controlled force. "Gentlemen in Parliament are quite capable of handling such matters without feminine interference." "Of course," Dr. Reed replied diplomatically, though his tone carried a subtle rebuke, "though I have found that the most effective reforms often come from those who can see beyond traditional boundaries. Fresh perspectives are invaluable in addressing entrenched problems." When Dr. Reed finally took his leave, he pressed Evelyn's hand with meaningful warmth. "I do hope you will find the materials useful, Your Grace. And please know that should you ever wish to discuss these matters further, I am entirely at your disposal." The moment the drawing-room door closed behind their visitor, the Duke's composure shattered completely. "How dare you encourage that man's presumptions?" he raged, his face flushed with anger and something that looked suspiciously like jealousy. "You made a spectacle of yourself, discussing matters far beyond your comprehension with a man who is clearly infatuated with you." Evelyn rose from her chair with fluid grace, the portfolio clutched in her hands like a shield. "Dr. Reed is a gentleman and a scholar who treats me with the respect due to an intelligent human being. If that seems foreign to you, perhaps you should examine your own behavior." "I am your husband," the Duke shouted, his carefully maintained facade crumbling entirely. "You owe me obedience and loyalty, not this brazen defiance." "You are the man who married me under false pretenses," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. "You are the man who publicly humiliated me and has spent months trying to break my spirit. You have forfeited any claim to my loyalty through your own actions." The Duke stepped closer, his grey eyes blazing with fury. "You forget yourself, madam. I could destroy you with a word, cast you out without a penny to your name. You would be nothing, no one, a social pariah with nowhere to turn." For a moment, the old fear flickered in Evelyn's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger, a quiet determination that spoke of inner strength forged in the fires of adversity. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I would be free, and freedom, your grace, is worth any price." The standoff that followed stretched between them like a taut wire, each waiting for the other to break. It was the Duke who finally turned away, his shoulders rigid with frustrated rage. "We return to Raven's Hollow tomorrow," he declared, his voice cold as Winterstone. "This foolishness ends now." But Lady Agatha had other plans. That evening, as Evelyn sat in her chambers reading the materials Dr. Reed had provided, her mentor appeared with news that would change everything. "My dear," Lady Agatha said, settling into the chair beside Evelyn's writing desk, "I have been thinking about your situation, and I believe the time has come for decisive action." "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked, though something in the older woman's tone made her heart race with anticipation. "I mean," Lady Agatha replied with a smile that was both gentle and fierce, "that you have a choice to make. You can return to Raven's Hollow and allow Adrian to slowly crush your spirit, or you can take control of your own destiny." Lady Agatha's proposal was breathtaking in its audacity. She owned a townhouse in Bloomsbury, in the heart of London's intellectual district, where progressive thinkers and reformers gathered to discuss the issues of the day. She offered Evelyn sanctuary there, along with the opportunity to pursue her intellectual interests without interference. "But the scandal," Evelyn protested, though her heart sang at the possibility of escape. "A wife who leaves her husband's house. I would be ruined in society." "Some parts of society, perhaps," Lady Agatha conceded, "but not the parts that matter. The world is changing, my dear, and women like you are helping to shape that change. Dr. Reed and his colleagues would welcome you with open arms, and there are others, writers, reformers, independent thinkers, who value intelligence over convention." The decision that faced Evelyn was perhaps the most important of her life. To stay meant accepting a future of psychological torment and spiritual death. To leave meant embracing uncertainty, but also the possibility of a life lived on her own terms. It was Dr. Reed's unexpected return the following morning that tipped the scales. He arrived just as the Duke's servants were loading their trunks for the journey back to Yorkshire, his face grave with urgency. "Your Grace," he said to Evelyn, ignoring the Duke's thunderous expression, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I could not let you leave without making you an offer that might change your life." The offer he presented was extraordinary. A group of progressive philanthropists was establishing a new institution dedicated to social reform and public health. They needed someone to head their research division, someone with intelligence, compassion, and the social standing to open doors that might otherwise remain closed. The position would provide you with independence, Dr. Reed explained, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face, both financial and intellectual. You would have the resources to pursue meaningful work, to make a real difference in the lives of those who need it most. The Duke's response was immediate and vicious. My wife will not be working like some common tradesman's daughter. The very suggestion is insulting. The suggestion, Dr. Reed replied with quiet dignity, is an honor offered to one of the finest minds I have encountered. Your Grace, he turned to Evelyn, the choice is yours to make. In that moment, standing in her London drawing room with her husband's rage crackling around her and Dr. Reed's respectful offer hanging in the air, Evelyn felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She thought of her mother, who had died young and unfulfilled, trapped by the conventions of her time. She thought of the women in Dr. Reed's articles, struggling against poverty and oppression with no voice to speak for them. I accept, she said, her voice clear and strong. I accept your offer, Dr. Reed. The explosion that followed was volcanic in its intensity. The Duke raged and threatened, alternately promising dire consequences and attempting to bribe her back to submission. But Evelyn stood firm, supported by Lady Agatha's unwavering presence and Dr. Reed's quiet strength. You will regret this, the Duke snarled as he finally prepared to leave for Yorkshire alone. You will come crawling back, begging for my forgiveness, and I will take great pleasure in refusing you. Perhaps, Evelyn replied with serene composure, but I would rather face an uncertain future as a free woman than a certain one as your prisoner. And Bill, as the Duke's carriage disappeared into the London traffic, Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. She was free, truly free, for the first time in her adult life. But what challenges awaited her in this new world she had chosen? And could she truly build a life of meaning and purpose from the ashes of her destroyed marriage? 6 months had passed since Evelyn walked away from her marriage and into an uncertain but hopeful future, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The cramped but charming townhouse in Bloomsbury had become her sanctuary, its book-lined walls and comfortable furnishings a stark contrast to the oppressive grandeur of Ravenshollow Castle. Here, surrounded by the gentle chaos of intellectual discourse and meaningful work, she had discovered not just freedom, but purpose. The Institute for Social Reform had flourished under her guidance, becoming a beacon of hope for London's most vulnerable citizens. From her modest office overlooking Russell Square, Evelyn coordinated research projects that were already influencing parliamentary debates on factory conditions, public health, and women's rights. Her reports, written with the clarity and passion that had so impressed Dr. Reed, were being quoted in newspapers and cited in the House of Commons. Your Grace, her assistant, Miss Sarah Whitmore, announced one crisp April morning, the delegation from Manchester has arrived for the factory conditions hearing. They're waiting in the conference room. Evelyn looked up from the correspondence she had been reviewing, her green eyes bright with the energy that came from work she truly believed in. Gone were the elaborate gowns and jewels of her ducal days, replaced by practical dresses in rich but subdued colours that spoke of professional competence rather than ornamental beauty. Yet she had never looked more radiant, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a life well lived. Thank you, Sarah. Please offer them tea and tell them I'll be with them momentarily. Evelyn gathered her notes, documents that represented months of careful research into the appalling conditions faced by textile workers in the industrial north. Today's hearing could lead to legislation that would save countless lives, and she felt the familiar thrill of knowing her work mattered. The conference room buzzed with animated conversation as mill workers, their representatives, and several sympathetic members of Parliament discussed the proposed reforms. At the head of the table sat Dr. Elias Reed, now not just a colleague, but something far more precious, a partner in every sense of the word. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than the passionate but shallow attraction that had characterized her courtship with the Duke. Dr. Reed had never pressed his suit, content to let their friendship deepen naturally as they worked side by side to improve the lives of London's poor. "Gentlemen," Evelyn said as she entered the room, her voice carrying the authority she had earned through months of dedicated work, "I trust you've had an opportunity to review the preliminary findings of our investigation." The discussion that followed was intense and productive, with Evelyn presenting evidence that painted a damning picture of industrial exploitation while offering practical solutions that balanced humanitarian concerns with economic realities. Her ability to speak the language of both reformers and businessmen had made her invaluable to the cause, and she watched with satisfaction as even the most skeptical participants began to nod in agreement with her proposals. "Your Grace," said Mr. Hartley, a mill owner who had initially opposed any reforms, "I must admit that your suggestions are far more reasonable than I had anticipated. The graduated implementation schedule you propose would allow us to make necessary changes without destroying our businesses." "That is precisely the goal, Mr. Hartley," Evelyn replied with a warm smile. "Reform need not mean ruin. Indeed, healthy workers are more productive workers, and improved conditions often lead to increased profits in the long term." As the meeting concluded with agreements that would have seemed impossible months earlier, Dr. Reed caught Evelyn's eye across the table. The look they shared spoke of professional triumph and personal pride, but also of something deeper, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. After the delegates had departed, Evelyn and Dr. Reed found themselves alone in the conference room, surrounded by the papers and documents that represented their shared mission. "Another victory," Dr. Reed said, his brown eyes warm with admiration. "You were magnificent today, Evelyn. The way you handled Hartley's objections was masterful." "We were magnificent," she corrected gently. "This work belongs to all of us, Elias. I may have presented the findings, but they represent the efforts of dozens of dedicated people." It was this humility, combined with her fierce intelligence and compassionate heart, that had made Dr. Reed fall so completely in love with her. He had watched her transform from a broken woman seeking refuge into a force for positive change, and with each passing day, his admiration had deepened into something far more profound. "Evelyn," he said softly, moving closer to where she stood organizing her papers, "there is something I must tell you, something I can no longer keep to myself." She looked up at him, her heart beginning to race at the intensity in his voice. Over the months of their collaboration, she had become increasingly aware of her growing feelings for this remarkable man who treated her as an equal and valued her mind as much as her heart. "I love you," he said simply, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the words. "I love your brilliant mind, your compassionate heart, your unwavering dedication to justice. I love the woman you have become, and the woman you have always been beneath the pain and fear." Evelyn felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Elias," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face with trembling fingers. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." The kiss they shared was everything her wedding kiss had not been, tender, passionate, and filled with genuine emotion. It spoke of partnership and equality, of two souls who had found in each other not just love, but a shared purpose that made them stronger together than they could ever be apart. "But I am still married," Evelyn said when they finally broke apart, the reality of her situation casting a shadow over their happiness. "The Duke will never grant me a divorce, and I cannot ask you to live in scandal for my sake." "Then we will find another way," Dr. Reed replied with quiet determination. "The world is changing, my darling. There are places where progressive thinkers are welcome, where a woman's worth is measured by her contributions rather than her marital status. I have been offered a position with the International Health Commission, Work that would take us to Paris, to Vienna, to cities where our love would be accepted and our work valued. The possibility he painted was breathtaking. A life of purpose and passion, free from the constraints of English society and the shadow of her disastrous marriage. Yet even as her heart soared at the prospect, Evelyn felt a pang of sadness for the life she would be leaving behind. It was Lady Agatha who provided the final push toward their new future. The elderly woman had become not just a mentor, but a surrogate mother, and her blessing meant everything to Evelyn. "My dear child," Lady Agatha said during one of their regular tea visits, "you have already paid a higher price for society's approval than any woman should have to bear. You owe nothing to those who would judge you for choosing happiness over convention." "But the scandal," Evelyn protested weakly, though her heart had already made its choice. "Let them scandalize," Lady Agatha replied with characteristic spirit. "You have built something beautiful from the ashes of your destroyed marriage. You have found love with a man who values you for who you truly are, and you have work that makes a real difference in the world. What more could any woman ask for?" The decision, when it finally came, felt as natural as breathing. On a warm evening in late spring, as they walked through the gardens of Russell Square, Evelyn accepted Dr. Reed's proposal, not of marriage, for that was impossible while she remained legally bound to the Duke, but of a life partnership that transcended legal formalities. "We will face whatever comes together," she said, her hand clasped firmly in his, as they watched the sunset paint the London sky in shades of gold and rose. "I choose love, Elias. I choose freedom. I choose you." The news of their departure spread quickly through London's reform circles, generating a mixture of admiration and concern. Some worried about the scandal that would inevitably follow, while others celebrated Evelyn's courage in choosing her own path. The Duke's reaction, when it finally came, was everything they had expected and more. He arrived at the Institute in a fury, demanding to see his wayward wife and threatening legal action against anyone who had aided her desertion. But the woman who met him in the conference room bore little resemblance to the frightened girl he had tormented at Ravenshollow Castle. Evelyn faced her husband with calm dignity, her hand resting confidently on a stack of reports that represented her new life's work. "Adrian," she said quietly, using his given name for the first time since their wedding day, "I had hoped we might part with some measure of civility." "Civility?" The Duke snarled, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been pain. "You abandon your marriage, your duties, your very name, and you speak to me of civility. I speak to you of freedom," Evelyn replied steadily. "The freedom to choose my own path, to use my mind and talents for something meaningful, to love and be loved in return. These are not luxuries, Adrian. They are basic human rights." You will regret this," he said, his voice dropping to the menacing whisper she remembered so well. "When your lover tires of you, when society shuns you completely, you will come crawling back, and I will be waiting." Evelyn looked at him with something approaching pity. "No, Adrian, I will not, because I have learned something you never understood, that a life lived in fear is no life at all. I would rather face an uncertain future with courage than a certain one in chains." Ijazim, as the Duke stormed from the building, his threats echoing in the hallway, Evelyn felt the last vestiges of her old life fall away. She was free, truly, completely free, to embrace whatever future awaited her. 3 weeks later, she stood on the deck of a steamship bound for Paris, Dr. Reed's arm around her waist as they watched the English coastline fade into the distance. In her travelling bag were letters of introduction to progressive thinkers across Europe, offers of work that would allow them to continue their mission of social reform on an international scale. "Any regrets?" Dr. Reed asked softly, his lips close to her ear. Evelyn smiled, her face turned toward the horizon and the new life that awaited them. "None," she said firmly. "I am exactly where I belong, with exactly the person I was meant to be with, For the first time in my life, I am truly home." And thus, as the ship carried them toward their new beginning, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had entered marriage as a naive girl seeking a fairy tale ending, only to discover that true happiness could not be found in someone else's story. She had been forced to write her own tale, one of courage and resilience, of love found in the most unexpected places, and of the transformative power of choosing one's own destiny. The Duke had married her to watch her suffer, but in the end she had found a way to bloom where she was planted, growing strong enough to transplant herself into soil where she could truly flourish. And in that flowering, she had discovered that the greatest revenge against those who would diminish us is simply to live fully, love deeply, and refuse to be anything less than who we were meant to be. If this story of courage and transformation has touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience and hope. Share in the comments below what part of this journey resonated most with you. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. Remember, like Lady Evelyn, we all have the power to rewrite our own stories. Sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply choosing to be happy.